This lesson, we're going to talk about a little bit more on inverse trig functions. So the last sessions, we said that domain of inverse function is very important. So I have another chart ready. Right? This is all other charts. So inverse trigonometry, having a domain range is very important. The value have to be inner domain. And also here, what about if we have other three trig functions? The other sections, we talk about sine, cosine, tangent, right? We didn't talk about secant, cosecant, and cotangent. So we're going to look at that first. So here, secant inverse of 1. So first, in order to be secant inverse 1, we should be able to convert that into cosine. In order to be 1, that's 1 over 1, so cosine should be 1 also, right? 1 over 1. And if your cosine is 1 over 1, then your A, which is going to be height, had to be 0. Because you get A equals square root of 1 square minus 1 square. So that will be 0. So when height is 0, your angle must be 0. So this height is 0, your angle must be 0. So your secant inverse 1 should be 0 degree, because this is going to be 0 degree. Let's look at cosecant inverse 2 then. So cosecant inverse 2 means you have 2 over 1. So when you convert this into the sine inverse, that becomes 1 over 2 because you flip the value, right? That means on a triangle, your sine is going to be 1 over 2. So height is 1 and the hypotenuse is 2. So that means your B should be square root of 2 square minus 1 square. So that gives you square root of 3. This is very familiar to us. We know this is going to be pi over 6 or 30 degree. And so this is going to be cosecant inverse 2 should be pi over 6. Pi over 6 in first quadrant. Why is it first quadrant? Because it was the positive. They were all positive values, right? So in order to be all positive, it had to be a first quadrant. Let's look at one more. What about cotangent? So cotangent inverse of negative square root of 3 over 1 is same as tangent inverse of negative 1 over square root of 3. So then I'm going to look for tangent on a triangle with 1 square root of 3. So then your C, hypotenuse, had to be square root of 3 square plus 1 square. So that gives you square root of 4, which is 2. So when your C is 2, again, that's familiar, which is pi over 6, right? So pi over 6, but this time negative. So let's go back, and cotangent, the inverse of negative square root of 3 should be pi over 6, 0, and between pi. So having a negative, it had to be second quadrant. So how do we find the second quadrant? Pi over 6 will be pi minus pi over 6. So that gives you 5 pi over 6. So example 2, we're going to look for exact value. This time difference from the last lecture was last lecture where you had sine with sine inverse or cosine with cosine inverse, but here you have a mixture. You have sine with cosine inverse mixture, tangent with cosine inverse mixture. In this case, when you have a mixture, what you need to do is you need to find all the size of the triangle, measurement of the triangle. So I'm going to show you that. Because what we're asking here is, what's the angle of triangle when the side of cosine is 3 over 5, right? So finding a measurement of the angle of that triangle, but then once we find the measurement or angle, they're asking what's the sine value of that angle, right? So instead of finding exact angle, we can just find the all three measurement of triangle and find the sine of that, right? So first step is going to be finding all three measurement of that triangle. The cosine is given as 3 over 5. So now we need to find the b. And your b can be found by hypotenuse square minus the side square. That gives you 25 minus 9, which is square root of 16. So b should be 4. And then find the sine of that triangle, right? So sine of that triangle is going to be 4 over 5. Let's see if it's going to be positive, negative. So when we're looking at this, cosine is 3 over 5, which is positive. And cosine inverse can be only first or second quadrants. And first quadrant will be positive, second quadrant will be negative, and you have positive. So this is going to be in a first quadrant. So this is going to be first quadrant. So this value have to be positive in order to be in first quadrant. So we know that's going to be positive, but you don't need to write the positive sign. Let's try one more time. This time you have cosine, sine inverse of negative 1 over square root of 16. So let's find the triangle of these values, right? So if you have a triangle, your sine is going to be that will be 1 over square root of 6. And which quadrant? This is sine is negative. Sine negative. So this is the domain of the sine. Sine is positive in first quadrant. Sine is negative in the fourth quadrant. So it means this had to be in fourth quadrant. Let's find my a value. So I can find my cosine of that triangle. And this is going to be square root of 6 square minus 1 square. So that gives you square root of 6 minus 1, which is square root of 5. So your a value is square root of 5. And then cosine of that is going to be that So it'll be square root of 5 over square root of 6. You need to rationalize that. So when you multiply numerator, denominator by square root of 6, you get square root of 30 over 6. We also need to find the signs. And this is the fourth quadrant. So fourth quadrant, cosine is positive, right? Because this is going to be positive and negative, right? Fourth quadrant. So cosine is going to be positive. But again, you don't need to put plus sign. So that should be the solutions. Let's try one more. This time tangent cosine inverse of negative 3 over 4. So let's do cosine is 3 over 4. And cosine domain is going to be from 0 to pi, so it'll be this. And cosine is negative in second quadrant, cosine positive in the first quadrant. Because cosine is negative, we know this is going to be on a second quadrant. So this is going to be second quadrant. So then let's find the b value. Your v value is going to be square root of 4 squared minus 3 squared, which is 16 minus 9. That's square root of 7. So then if we wanted to find the tangent of it, right? So that gives you square root of 7 over 3. And square root of 7 over 3, tangent in a second quadrant. Tangent in a second quadrant is going to be negative. That's the value. If we try a few more this time, let's combine cosecant with tangent, right? No matter what's mixed, use the inner functions to find the a right triangle first. So the tangent is 1/3. Let's see what will be the quadrant. Tangent had to be first and fourth. Tangent positive, tangent negative, right? So then, because you have a negative value, we know this is going to be fourth quadrant. Let's find your C, which is your hypotenuse. That's going to be 3 squared plus 1 squared. So that will be square root of 9 plus 1 is 10. So then your sine is going to be 1 over. So sine is going to be 1 over square root of 10. Means cosecant is going to be square root of 10 over 1. So it will be square root of 10. What's the sine or cosecant sine on the fourth quadrant? Fourth quadrant, right? Fourth quadrant is going to be negative. Right? Because sine negative in fourth quadrant. Let's try one last one. So tangent inverse 7 over 24. So let's find that triangle. Tangent 7, 24. So in order to find the hypotenuse, we do square root of 24 squared plus 7 squared. That gives you a pretty large number, 49 plus 576. That gives you square root of 625, which is 25. And if we wanted to find the sine of that, it will be 7 over 25. So that's how we find the value of it. Let's see if we can find the sine, right? So tangent, remember tangent had to be either first and second quadrant. Fourth quadrant when it's inverse, right? And tangent positive in a first quadrant. So this had to be first quadrant. And in a first quadrant, your sine is also positive. So since you don't need to write the positive sign, it will be just 7 over 25.